The rain came down in torrents, a relentless deluge that pounded the earth like the fury of an angry god. The remote cabin sat nestled in the heart of the dense forest, isolated from the rest of the world. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway for a group of 5 friends: Mark, Sarah, Mike, Emily, and Chris. They had heard rumors about the cabin, whispers of its mysterious past, but none of them truly believed the stories. As they arrived at the cabin, they couldn't help but be impressed by its rustic charm. Its wooden exterior was weathered and worn, but it had a cozy, inviting feel. The rain had started to fall just as they arrived, and by the time they had unpacked their bags, it had intensified into a full-blown thunderstorm. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the forest in eerie flashes. "Looks like we're in for quite a storm," Mark remarked, peering out of the cabin's small windows. "Perfect timing," Sarah said, trying to sound cheerful. "We'll be safe and dry in here." Little did they know that the storm would trap them in more ways than one. The first night passed relatively uneventfully. They lit a fire in the stone fireplace, played board games, and shared stories over a few bottles of wine. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling through the trees, and the rain hammering the cabin's roof like an incessant drumbeat. Around midnight, Emily, who had been sleeping in the bedroom on the ground floor, was awoken by a faint whispering sound. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice was soft and unintelligible, but it seemed to be coming from somewhere inside the cabin. She strained her ears, trying to make out the words. "Who's there?" Emily called out, her voice trembling. No response. She could still hear the rain and the wind outside, but the whispering had stopped. She dismissed it as a trick of her imagination and lay back down, but sleep eluded her for the rest of the night. The next morning, Emily didn't mention the strange incident to her friends. She didn't want to be the one to start a panic over nothing. Besides, they were all there to relax and have a good time, and the cabin was just as charming in the daylight as it had been the night before. As the day wore on, they explored the woods surrounding the cabin, went for a swim in the nearby lake, and even attempted some fishing in the rain. The storm showed no sign of letting up, but it didn't dampen their spirits. That evening, as they gathered around the fireplace once more, the atmosphere had subtly changed. The cabin seemed darker, the walls closing in on them. The fire crackled and hissed, casting eerie shadows on the wooden beams above. Sarah, always the skeptic, tried to lighten the mood. "You guys remember that old legend about this place, right? They say it's haunted," she said, grinning. "Haunted?" Chris scoffed. "Come on, Sarah. You can't seriously believe that nonsense." "It's just a story," Mike chimed in. "Besides, I don't see any ghosts around here." Mark, however, was less dismissive. He had grown up in a small town not far from the cabin and had heard the stories from locals all his life. They spoke of strange happenings, missing people, and a sense of foreboding that seemed to hang over the place. "I've heard things," Mark admitted quietly. "People disappearing in these woods, never to be found again. And there's something about this cabin, something unnatural." His words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Sarah laughed nervously, trying to brush off the tension that had settled among them. "Just stories, guys," she said. "Let's not ruin our weekend with old ghost stories." But the unease lingered, and that night as they settled into their respective bedrooms, it became impossible to ignore. Emily, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, kept the bedside lamp on. She lay there, listening to the relentless rain and the howling wind, trying to convince herself that everything was fine. Then it began again. The whispering. Soft, indistinct voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Emily's heart raced as she strained to hear the words. This time they were clearer, but still just beyond comprehension. She felt a presence in the room with her, an oppressive weight in the air. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. But there was no reply. The whispers continued, growing louder and more urgent, as if pleading for something. Emily pulled the covers over her head, squeezing her eyes shut, desperately trying to block out the eerie sounds. Morning came, but Emily emerged from her room feeling exhausted and drained. She couldn't bring herself to tell the others about what had happened. They were already on edge from the previous night's conversation, and she didn't want to add to their fears. As the day progressed, the atmosphere in the cabin grew increasingly tense. The friends tried to distract themselves with games and conversation, but it was clear that something was wrong. Emily caught glimpses of fear in their eyes, a shared unease that they couldn't shake. That evening, as the storm continued to rage outside, they decided to conduct a makeshift seance. It was meant to be a joke, a way to lighten the mood, but as they sat in a circle, their hands resting on a makeshift Ouija board they had fashioned from a piece of wood and a few scraps of paper, the atmosphere grew heavy with anticipation. "Is there anyone here with us?" Sarah asked, her voice quivering. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly but surely, the wooden planchette began to move, spelling out words on the paper beneath it. They watched in horror as it spelled out a name, Elizabeth. The cabin seemed to come alive around them. Shadows danced on the walls, and the whispering grew louder, more insistent. The friends scrambled to their feet, knocking over the makeshift Ouija board in their haste to get away. "We need to leave," Mark said, his voice trembling. "There's something in this cabin, something evil." But leaving wasn't an option. The storm outside had intensified, and the rain pounded the roof like a relentless drumbeat. The windows rattled, and the wind howled through the trees. They spent a sleepless night huddled together in the living room, the fear and tension in the air palpable. The whispers continued, growing louder and more desperate, as if they were trying to communicate something important. As dawn broke, the storm finally began to subside. Exhausted and shaken, the friends packed their bags and made a hasty retreat from the cabin. They left behind the mysteries and terrors that had plagued them, but they would carry the memories of that fateful weekend with them forever. In the days that followed, they tried to put the experience behind them, to convince themselves that it had all been a shared delusion brought on by fear and the storm. But deep down they knew that something had been in that cabin with them, something ancient and malevolent. Years later, when they reunited to reminisce about that weekend, they would still shudder at the memory of the whispers and the shadowy figures that had haunted them. They would never know the true nature of the cabin's sinister secret, but they had learned a valuable lesson, that sometimes the stories we dismiss as mere legends and superstitions are rooted in a terrifying reality that we can never fully understand.